Good morning. Thank you all for being here at Hudson Institute. My name is Rebeccah Heinrichs. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson and our director of our Keystone Defense Initiative. And I am thrilled. This has been my vision for more than a year now at this point to have Douglas Murray here with us. And so I'm thrilled to have him here. I wanted to just explain for those of you who are familiar with my work, those of you who are listening online, and then here in the audience, you might wonder kind of what's the connection here. And I just want to sort of paint a little bit of a vision of why I think this is so important to host Douglas. And it's so directly relevant to the work I do here. So my work is really focused on deterring and then winning, if deterrence fails, a major war. So I look at the development of alliances, obviously on the part of the United States side, but then also the growing development of axes. And so what I've really noted over the years is this, here at Hudson, my colleagues have as well, this axis of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But the other thing that's going on here in the United States, I think, is there's a confusion about what is true realism and how you contend with this axis. Does realism require us to only look at balances of power, or must we, which is my view, understand the idiosyncrasies of the various components of this axis and then understand the motivations, their ideologies, the nature of the regime, their willingness to take on risk and to absorb pain, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what we need to understand what the West needs to do to defend ourselves and our civilization, and then to also understand the nature of the adversary. And here we have Douglas, who I think is providing medicine to the commentariat and to academia and the think tank world, to really a dose of medicine so that we might understand, especially the nature of Islamist militantism, radicalism, jihad, but then also in his great book, which I highly recommend and commend to you, and we're going to discuss it today, on democracies and death cults, Israel and the future of civilization. He also mentions his trips that he's made into Ukraine. He's been to Ukraine, I think, 3 times since the full-scale invasion, Putin's unprovoked war in 2022. And then since the atrocities committed by Hamas against the Jewish state on October 7th, you've been there many times, I think. And so, and you've really done all of us a great service in explaining what he has seen there and what he has learned so that we can be edified by it. So Douglas, thank you so much for your moral clarity, for your courage in physically going to these dangerous places and providing us with the details in your book. So I'm first, thank you. But second of all, let's just get right into it. Why did you write this book? And you've been going on a book tour, but how has it been received? And we'll just start there.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Rebeccah. It's a great pleasure to be back at Hudson. I spoke here, I was for the launch of a book in 2006, so almost 20 years ago now, which begins to make me feel ancient. And I remember that among the group, we had a lunch afterwards, and I remember it was a wonderful occasion, both the event and the lunch, because Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb were there, and now late also Judge Robert Bork. And I remember that Judge Bork heard one of the answers I gave to one of the questions, and at lunch afterwards said to me something I have never forgotten and have always been terrified by, which he said, Douglas, you disappointed me in one of your answers. I thought, oh no. He said, you used the word freedom without any caveat. He said, of course, freedom is not an unalloyed good. And anyhow, he went on and balked me, as it were, quite deeply. And I have never since that day used the word without a lot of Borkian caveats. So anyway, you can throw anything at me today. No, it's a great pleasure to be back. The first thing is that, as you alluded to, I went to Israel, actually lived there for most of the year after the 7th because of several things. One was that I knew that the news cycle these days dictates that something like, not that there have been many things like, but the 7th of October happens. The news cycle moves straight on within 24 hours to what will Israel do in response. I thought, this is such a huge event that it should be more than just a moment that you then do the media, what will happen in response questions to. And although there have been many fine journalists and writers in Israel and outside of Israel who've gathered up a lot of the information about the 7th, the atrocities, the victims, the heroes, and the failures of that day. I wanted to make sure I found out as much as I could firsthand about how it had happened and what had happened. And the second thing was that I knew that there would be a military response from the Israelis. Inevitably, 250 hostages were abducted, as well as the 1,200 people murdered. And I knew there'd be a military response, and I wanted to see that firsthand, because my experience of particularly operations involving the Israeli military is that absolutely anything can be said about them. And I wanted to be able to see that firsthand. But also, I suppose the other point of the book is that there was an oddity that struck me very early on. I was both unsurprised by it and still deeply shocked, which was the oddity of, even in the immediate aftermath of the atrocity, the amount of support that was happening in America for the people who'd carried out the atrocity. And I am saying near the opening of this book that I was at my home in New York, and I went on the 7th, and I went down to Times Square on the 8th, and wrote about it for the New York Post. But on the 8th, there were these protests in Times Square in support of Hamas and justifying the massacre that was still ongoing. And that was one of the things that told me early on, I've got to get there, because this is going to have repercussions, not just in the Middle East, repercussions here at home in America too. And I think the last 18 months have borne that out.
So let's talk. You start off in your book talking about the first things that you noticed when you went into Israel, and also things that I didn't know about, which is even the survivors, the suffering that is still ongoing with the those who were at the festival. So tell us what you can about. Because Israel is still, it has to constantly be sort of cultivating its reputation, because the whole world scrutinizes its response, not just militarily, but everything else. But can you tell us some of the things that you saw? PTSD doesn't really seem to be an adequate description of what those who were there and survived are still suffering from, but the effect that it's had on them and their families.
Well, the first thing is, there's a question which I started forming in my head from the moment I got there, which was the result of interviewing survivors in the hospitals and elsewhere, which was the number of people who, I'm sure all of you know, but a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the communities in the South that were attacked, they have security teams, or a security person, a man and his family, who be there to protect the community should such a thing have happened. But none of these communities ever expected something like this to happen, because nobody ever expected a land invasion. Every single house in the South has a mamad, a safe room in the house. But these safe rooms are made for the sadly routine rocket fire that has come from Gaza since the Israelis withdrew in 2005. And one of the crucial details was that, of course, they shut, but they don't. The doors shut, but they don't lock. And they don't lock precisely because people were not expecting Hamas terrorists or anyone else to be coming house to house. And so a lot of the stories I gather of families, men, women, children, teenagers, trying to hold the doors shut, and Hamas would fire from the other side, and a lot of the survivors in these places described to me, there's one man in particular I describe in the book, whose wife and son were killed in front of him in the safe room. And he lost his legs and managed to survive alongside his one daughter. That he said to me, he just remembered saying from the get-go, as they were in the safe room and as Hamas started to burn their house, he was saying to his children, his wife, "Don't worry, the IDF will be here in minutes." And they weren't. Now, one of the things is, of course, there were a lot of military who did get there. There were units like Dov Devan who got down there as soon as they got there. But there was a lot of confusion. And I think a lot of the confusion is still not understood because there hasn't been a commission of inquiry. There hopefully will be at some point into the failings of what happened. But for me, this was the central failing, was how could a family in Israel be in this position with all of the deterrence, all of the military and technological and intelligence capabilities. How could it be that so many people said to their loved ones, they'll be here in minutes, and in some cases it was hours and hours and hours. And that's partly to do with the very intelligent way in which Hamas went about their brutality. They took down a lot of the communications networks. They knew exactly where they were going. From the bodies of dead terrorists, I've seen the maps that some of them brought into Israel with them, dictating where they should go and when. There's a town called Ofakim, about 20 kilometers in, which is one of the furthest places the terrorists, 4,000 people, 4,000 terrorists, a massive army of terrorists came in. In Ofakim, the 14 or so terrorists that got in there, on the furthest encroachments, they had a map which dictated not just where the one member of the Knesset, the parliament who lived there, where his house was, but where the kindergarten was and where the synagogue was, because they knew it was a holy day. And so there was a level of specificity about it, which largely came about, sadly, because of Gazan workers who had been encouraged by the Israeli government and the international community to be working inside Israel, and many of whom worked effectively as spies for Hamas and scouts. But I wanted to address this failing, and I put it to the highest ranks of the Israeli military and government. And I mean, one of the things that is of interest, I suppose, particularly here, is that there was also a conceptual failing on the part of the Israelis, which is what they have called the conception. And the conception was that, like so many death cults and terrorist groups and totalitarian regimes in history, Hamas might get to the position where they were just happy being corrupt,
right?
And that they were just happy living in, American and European taxpayer-paid luxury apartments in Qatar, and they would just, buy their children expensive cars and immiserate the Gazans, but that they would be happy. And of course, that was one of the fundamental mistakes, was actually Hamas as such ideologues, that they wanted to both be corrupt and to annihilate the Jewish people.
Right, and that's it's really the point that I think is, if not the most important one, certainly one of them in your work, is that it's very difficult for those of us in the West, and I use it sort of, liberal democracies, people who just want to get along and be pluralistic and live aside people who you disagree with on important things, is that we have a really hard time understanding the motivation behind such ideologies that would delight in the suffering of other human beings. But I thought this was really important. It seemed to me that part of Hamas's strategy, and you just were getting at it, was to sort of puncture this image of invincibility that not just the Israelis had about the IDF and about what they could do, but those of us in the United States, we think of like, oh my goodness, Israel is the size of New Jersey and it can stay alive and protected, surrounded by people who wish it harm because they're so good at what they do. And so there's this strong psychological component to the strategy of Hamas. And can you speak, because you said, for those of you who have your books here on page 12, he says, page 12, what happened that morning came as a shock, not just to Israel, but to the world. There was something so completely unexpected about it. In part, Israel had for years displayed an aura of invincibility, which to me, and I'll have you kind of talk about that, why, which like the pager counting of capital was so important to like redeem itself in some way on this reputation.
Absolutely. I was thinking when I was studying what Hamas did and the plans for their attacks. And by the way, one part I try to bring across in the book, but it's very little known outside of Israel, is that there had been a plan that the Iranian revolutionary government in Tehran was behind, certainly knew about, which was that the plan was that as Hamas did this from the south, Hezbollah would do the same thing from the north. And we know, I was in southern Lebanon with the IDF last year, and we know from the intelligence they gathered there that was the plan. You might ask, well, why didn't Hezbollah join in until the 8th when they started firing rockets immediately? And it was because the two groups, although they had the same plan, the plan was essentially you would be able to meet in the middle and throttle the country. which again, I mean, I've had discussions with people in recent days on disputatious podcasts, shall I say, who have no idea that that was one of the scales and the visions behind this. But the desire was to do that. Hamas seemed to have not communicated the exact date and time to Hezbollah because they believed correctly, I think, that there was no channel via which they could communicate this without it being intercepted by someone, Israel, one of Israel's allies, and therefore the whole plan going disappearing. But when I considered what Hamas had done on the day, I was one of the things that came to mind was a discussion I had many years ago with a friend of mine who used to be one of the NATO commanders in Europe, a very fine man called General Klaus Naumann from Germany. And I remember he said to me years ago, when we were talking about Clausewitz, and he said, you know, Clausewitz, as the years go by, is wrong on some things, inevitably, because he was talking about Napoleonic-style conflicts where armies would line up like that against each other. And I remember General Naumann saying, you know, and I reflect on it in the book, that the part of the Clausewitzian thing is that you should hit your enemy at their center of gravity. Now that was the case, you know, far better than me, but that was the case in the past in warfare. But in modern warfare, that might turn out to be absolutely wrong. If you decided to attack the Israelis by going for the Dimona nuclear plant or the Knesset, that's very unlikely to work. But you attack peace-loving communities in the south of Israel, kibbutzim. You attack young people at a dance party in the early hours of the morning. You attack a base of female observers, not soldiers, at the Nahal Oz base. These are effectively, it's very interesting. It shows that in the modern era, Clausewitz was essentially wrong. Actually, it's best if you're going to sweep an enemy off its feet in this era, you do what a cage fighter does. You attack them at the extremities, at the soft extremities, because this is where you can be successful. This is what knocked Israel off its feet for a matter of hours, maybe days. On the 7th of October, it was that these were such incredibly soft targets. And that's what threw the country off balance, among other things. But that is a kind of brilliant realization of Sinwar, the Hamas leader, now defunct, but who organized the 7th. And I mentioned, by the way, about him that he was a subject of fascination for me for many years because he was obviously a psychopath. And I spoke with a number of people, therapists who, not for my personal use, I should say. I don't need an army of therapists yet. But I spoke to many therapists who are working with survivors and others. And one of the brilliant insights one of them made to me very early on at a reunion of the Nova survivors was, she said, don't forget, Douglas, that a psychopath is almost certainly born a psychopath, but a sociopath has to be made. And Sinwar was some type of psychopath. He was in prison in the 2000s in Israel for throttling Palestinians to death, literally with his own hands killing Palestinians in Gaza. That's why he was in an Israeli jail. But he created, in my view, in my analysis, he created a generation of sociopaths. But just one other thing on Sinwar, if I may. He was, when he was in Israeli prison in the 2000s, he was, of course, swapped in this very regrettable, but at the time seemed necessary swap for the one soldier, Gilad Shalit, and more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, torturers, murderers. Sinwar was one of the people released, and but we know quite a lot about him, not just from his public pronouncements before and after leaving Israeli prison, but from the conversations he had with a dentist who actually saved his life in prison in Israel, who noticed that Sinwar was falling over when he was getting up from prayers, noticed he almost certainly had some kind of brain tumor, sends him to the hospital in Israel. They discover he has a brain tumor, they operate on him, they save his life. By the way, the dentist who saved Sinwar's life, his nephew was murdered in near Oz on the 7th by Sinwar's forces. But Sinwar said to him in one conversation in prison, he said, at the moment you, Israel, are strong. You seem strong. But he said, but one day you'll be weak, and then I'll come. And that was what he did.
Just as you're talking there, I was thinking, maybe in this particular case, the center of gravity for the Israelis is not their nuclear program, but it is something of what Israel kind of means and represents, which is the defense of innocent, pluralism, respect for the human person, and a sense of it, not invincibility, but a sense of strength from there because they had the United States as its closest ally, and to sort of attack there in a way is kind of Clausewitzian on the part of Sinwar. To attack Israel kind of there right at its heart.
Right. Interesting.
There's kind of a psychological, but anyway, as I was kind of thinking, because they would not have succeeded. They would not have had the success that they've had from October 7th. Not that it's been successful, but we'll talk about that, the effect that it's had globally on, since October 7th. But you mentioned here, because I think this is so important, page 112 in the book, the response in the West, and there's various shades of anti-Semitism, and you kind of go through kind of what they might look like and how they may manifest. But you say here, anti-Semitism provides a perpetual conundrum for Jews. But the thing that makes it stand out as a challenge for non-Jews is what it says about a society that indulges it. Because a final aspect of anti-Semitism that is worth dwelling on is what it in fact means. So tell us what you have observed, and I've watched many of your interviews that you have done about your book and since October 7th, and it sort of seems like you always have these interviewers that don't quite get it. They still don't. They still want to pick on the Israelis.
I've noticed that. Yeah. This is a welcome reprieve.
So tell us, but it's so important that we grasp it. And I think even for those there's our anti-Semites, and what do you do about sort of the modern sort of Nazi ideology? But then there's people who should know better,
yes,
and they still don't seem to get it. So what?
Yes, the brilliant Ruth Wise, emeritus professor at Harvard, and one of the only people who adds luster to that institution's name these days, said in an interview on the anniversary of the 7th of October that she said a lot of people some people had the courage to say what was absolutely demonstrably obvious, which is that October 7th was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. That is a statement of fact, which some people found it hard to say. But as she observed with a razor-like mind, brilliant observation, she said, but very few people had the courage to say, well, then what's the layer behind that? I.e., then who are the Nazis? And then the question behind that, why are there so many of their supporters among us? This is a question that almost no American institution has had the capability to ask, I think. Certainly no educational institution has had the capability to ask since the 7th. The question with the backlash in America is not, is there a lack of understanding about a foreign conflict? Yes, always. I mean, it's fine. I mean, same in Britain. I mean, I would say, in Britain, maybe 10% of people care about Israel for it, 10% maybe against it, and 80% want to watch the football. Fine. It's not their fault. But the deliberate misunderstanding and the deliberate misreading, this is something different. And this is of the two conflicts I've covered in the last few years, of Ukraine and Israel. The Ukrainian conflict, people have a very little understanding of on the ground, outside of the expert sort of class, but there's a sort of broad recognition of what they're doing, and that the Ukrainian military, for instance, are not seeking to commit genocide against the Russian people, for instance. I mean, nobody makes claims that outlandish about the Ukrainian armed forces, but they do about the IDF, and they did not only immediately from the 7th, they did it since 2005. I was reminding somebody recently in a debate that it not only is ridiculous to do this genocide accusation against the IDF since the 7th of October, and they've done it since then, it's also ridiculous because they've been doing it since the Israeli withdrawal in 2005. All the people who are saying that Israel has been committing genocide in Gaza since October 7th said that they were doing it since 2005. And as I say, among other things, it's quite interesting because it would be, I mean, it's either a totally lurid fantasy, which it is, or it's a totally lurid fantasy that doesn't even work on the maths because the population of Gaza has doubled since 2005. So you've got to choose which one. The same people who say Israel is committing genocide keep saying there's a disproportionate number of young people in Gaza. Half of them are young people. You think, yes, that's right. I remember there was such a population boom in Auschwitz in the 40s.
Right.
I mean, really, you can do one of these things, but not both. But they do. They do. What it says about us is very interesting. I think that one is the number of people who actually have decided to, well, there are people who are just pro-Hamas. Fine. There are people who are pro-Hamas because they believe Hamas is the legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. Bad call, but okay. There are people who are playing with something like what Tom Wolfe would have called terrorist chic. You know, you don your keffiyeh and you're not quite sure what it means or what the historical thing is, but it's this generation Che Guevara t-shirt.
It's kind of against the man.
Yeah, and then there are people so just like wildly uninformed who have a platform. I was debating one of them yesterday, and who's spent the last 18 months going around talking about Israeli military strategy and that Gaza's a concentration camp and that there's genocide and everything. And halfway through the discussion, I asked when he'd last been to one of the border crossings, even in Gaza, and he admitted he'd never been to the region. And as I said to him, I said, well, do you have to have been somewhere to talk about it? My own view is yes, old-fashioned. It'll never catch on. But I said to him, if you're going to spend 18 months making lurid claims about what an army is doing, you should at least do the region the courtesy of dropping in, you know. But a lot of people are under a set of unbelievable delusions about what Israel has been doing. I mean, even to the extent that I've discovered that there are certain talking points you hear from Israeli officials and others which are true, but have started to run out of effectiveness, such as the observation that, which is true, that the way Hamas operates and the way that Israel operates is in complete, diametrically opposite strands. The Israelis will go in and fight and risk the lives of their own soldiers to get a Jewish child, an Israeli child, out of Hamas captivity, and many young soldiers' lives have been lost in attempted extractions of hostages in the last 18 months. But, you know, obviously you're dealing with an army on the other hand, which, as I quote in the book, one of the Hamas leaders was interviewed on Al Arabiya last year and was asked by the Arabic interviewer, why do you not allow the citizens of Gaza to shelter in the tunnel system you've built under the whole of the Gaza? Which, as I sometimes say to my friends in New York, is not just as long as the New York subway, but rather better run. And why do you not allow them to shelter here? And the response to the Hamas official is because the tunnels are not for the population. The tunnels are for our rockets and for our fighters. Now, many Israelis and others have pointed this out, but very, very little of the world's observers of this conflict, readers, absorbers of this conflict, have any notion of what this actually looks like on the ground in terms of house-to-house fighting. You know, there was a moment, when was it, late last year, where you've referred to, there was a moment where I say within a year of the start of the war, I borrow it from General Slim, Israel went from defeat into victory. And there was this extraordinary, historic month where not only does this long-planned operation of the Pages operation take out, in the most targeted strike in military history, the most targeted strike, 3,000 Hezbollah operatives maimed, killed, injured in one go like that. And then the walkie-talkies the next day. And then a bit later, Nasrallah goes to meet his maker. And then Sinwar, the architect of the 7th, is finally found. Now, when Sinwar was found finally in Rafah, much of the world's media reported this as it was a fluke, which is very, very interesting. They said it was a fluke. The soldier who killed him didn't know he'd killed Sinwar. That is true. He didn't know that he'd killed Sinwar. But that morning, 4 people cropped up from one of the tunnels, and this was in a deserted area where the population had been asked to leave. And I was in Rafah the next day to see with the Bizlach who'd killed him, and the extraordinary thing was they cropped up. The soldiers saw them. They engaged them. They shot back. 2 of them turned out to be Sinwar's bodyguards. One, of course, was an UNRWA worker, again employed by you and me, happily. Great use for our taxpayers' dollars. And one of the others went missing for about 24 hours, and they found him. And then the other one was Sinwar. He was killed. But the world's media reported this as if this was a fluke. And it wasn't a fluke. It was a result of 1 year's unbelievably hard fighting by the young men and women of the IDF in Gaza, in order that Sinwar had nowhere left to run on this earth. And that's why he crops up in Rafah by the Egyptian border with passports and cash, clearly trying to do a runner. But every detail of the war, it's amazing to me that the extent to which sheer lies about the military operation and its objectives have been ignored. And one final thing on that, if I may, which is I have yet to hear from anybody an alternative plan for what a country should do when, as you say, you are attacked at your, let's say, emotional center of gravity. I know that this is a game of extrapolation. Not everyone can seem to follow, but of course, by proportion of population, Israel having a population of only 9 million people, what happened on the 7th is the equivalent to 44,000 Americans being massacred in one day and 10,000 being taken hostage. But nobody can tell me that if there were 10,000 Americans in dungeons in a neighboring country, that this country wouldn't have to formulate a policy to get them out. And as I say, I have yet to hear from anyone any plan better than the one that the IDF has pursued over the last year. None of the hostages have been released, and there are still some dozens of hostages in captivity, including young New Jersey-born American Eden Alexander, who's 21, still in Hamas captivity as we speak. I have yet to hear a plan anyone has for the release of these hostages from the 7th, from the moment they were stolen, because none of the hostages who were given back so far, who have been rescued, have been given back or rescued because Hamas is decent. They have been given back because of the use of kinetic military force against Hamas. And as I say, I look at protesters and others on elite institutions in this country, and I think, what is it you think you know about a military operation to get back hostages that the IDF and the Israeli government does not? But, we live in an era of insta-experts, and I do notice that the people who are military experts on Gaza are also currently experts on tariffs. And last month, they were super experts on mineral extraction in the east of Ukraine. So it's amazing what you can do with a laptop and some spare time.
It's on social media.
Social media, yeah. My favorite one is, I've done the research on this. Yeah, I bet you're at the Library of Congress.
Well, on that point, I can't help but think that the anti-Semitism. So I view that to the extent that the United States has tolerated anti-Semitism in the name of free speech or that it's an indicative of a societal sickness. In part, it's like it's a self-loathing because of what the anti-Semites represent. I mean, and how do you look at Israel and the nature of the Israeli government and the people versus Hamas and choose Hamas? I mean, just so there's something there, I think, and that also relates to, and I do want to just briefly, while I have you, because you do mention your trips to Ukraine, that the reason that Hamas could pull this off now and get its support is because it's correlating with this lack of self-confidence in our own worth as Westerners and what we represent, and the decline of the United States and the UK is the accusation from our adversaries. So, is that what it is? I mean, I think you would say yes. There's some of that going on, but how does it relate to your going to Ukraine, seeing the Ukrainians fight, and then sort of this odd dynamic in the United States politically where some are confused about who the aggressor is and who the defenders are?
I think there's several things. I mean, one is I have observed that there's a form of anti-Americanism. I do think it's that. There's a form of anti-Americanism that used to be prevalent on the American left and has become a growing business on the American right. And it seems to, among other things, start from the presumption that only we in America and the West do anything or are responsible for anything. So, for instance, if Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, it must be that we made him. So, if we hadn't made him a bad man, he wouldn't have been bad. It's a very narcissistic form of thinking, among other things. I mean, sometimes people can be bad without you having a darn thing to do with it. It's always this argument you hear now, as I say, on the right, like it used to come from the left. We made them do it. If we hadn't have done this, X wouldn't have happened. And it presumes that there's no other actors in the world, I'm amazed when people, for instance, will talk about the collapse of Syria since 2011 and talk exclusively about the really pretty minuscule American and other Western involvement, because the main actors in Syria were really from outsiders, were Russia and Iran, the Iranian revolutionary government. But they're not interested in working out Russian military operations in Syria, mainly because they can't read the language, and in any case, the Russian press doesn't report, amazingly enough, freely. And the same thing with the mullahs. Maybe it's something to do with the bias of just the simple thing of absorbing what information is available in English and something like that. But there's this shortcut that used to be on the American left of I would simply analyze things by what involvement we have had and then see us as being the bad actors. And as I say, I think this is, among other things, not only is it analytically wrong, it's patriotically wrong, because it always assumes and presumes the best intentions on the part of anyone other than America and the West. Like Hamas must act as they do because America and America's allies like Israel made them. Right. Maybe when they say we love death as you love life, and maybe when they have this orgiastic ecstasy in violence, maybe it's because that's what they believe. But this gets back to this thing of you mentioned about what anti-Semitism means. And I think that as I say, it's obviously always a catastrophe for Jews, but it's always a catastrophe for the rest of the society as well, because it always comes up as a sort of a sign of weakness in the body. I quote one of my great heroes, Vasily Grossman, in the book, where he says, in the middle of Life and Fate, this great analysis of anti-Semitism that he spends 4 pages doing. And anyway, it's an extraordinary passage, because one of the things he says is everywhere all that anti-Semitism is, it tells you nothing about the Jews, but it tells you only about the person who suffers from it. He describes anti-Semitism as a mirror that exposes the failings of state systems, individuals, and much more. And I've been I've been thinking about what I now call Grossman's law for the last 18 months, and there's several versions of it that I think are very, very useful, or various things that Grossman's great insight does, which are very useful for us. The first one is a sort of, to me, it's quite a hilarious one in the region, that absolutely whatever the other powers in the region accuse the Israelis of is what they're doing. Absolutely cast iron rule. The Iranian revolutionary government claims that Israel is a colonizing state. And when the Ayatollah Khamenei sent his thank you letter to American students last year, he said, "Thank you so much for joining the great fight against colonialism." The biggest colonialist power in the Middle East since 1979 has been the Iranian revolutionary government. They colonized Iran, subdued it for all my adult life. They've colonized Iraq, moved in after we left, and whilst we were still there. They colonized Syria, they colonized and helped destroy Lebanon, they colonized Yemen. So if you're anti-colonialist, you should join me in being anti the Iranian revolutionary government. But this is a very interesting one. One of my other favorites is the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, constantly says that Israel is an occupying power. Anyone who's been to northern Cyprus, or indeed southern Cyprus, will know that half of Cyprus, an EU member state, is still occupied by the Turkish government. All that Mr. Erdogan is telling us when he says the Israelis, the Jewish state, the Jews are occupiers, is he's an occupier. How does this relate back home here to in America? And here's something that I realized in the last 18 months was a very, very interesting thing that in my previous book, in The War in the West, I described the way in which this system of thought had come up in America, particularly American universities, that constantly claimed that this country, particularly this country, but the West in general, was guilty of a set of certain sins. And the sins were colonialism, white supremacy, racism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, a set of them. And I said in that book, you have a big moral problem that you're setting up here. And particularly leaning on some of the work of Hannah Arendt, I gave this explanation of what I saw as being the moral problem that this would give to American youth, which was you are being told you're guilty of something, which you actually had nothing to do with. I mean, all of the accusations in question are highly disputable anyway. But you had nothing to do with this. If you're born in 2005 and able to speak, sadly, I discover they are, it seems unbelievably young to me now, but if you are born in 2005, why are you guilty of slavery? Mm-hmm. If you're in college in Boston, what did you have to do with the slave trade? What did you have to do with the treatment of indigenous Americans? Or what did you have to do with colonialism? And I said, among other things, even if every single one of these accusations was true, what you're saying is you are guilty and there's no way to atone. That's what Arendt's observation in one of her essays that I used there was, there is no mechanism that unlocks that problem. The religious systems, particularly Judeo-Christian religious tradition, has a very powerful unlocking mechanism, which is forgiveness. But that system that was set up is designed for there to be no forgiveness ever. Not possible, even 250 years, or 300 years on, there's no way to get out of it. But I realized since October the 7th that many of the people who've ignited across this country, not just on elite campuses, I think one of the things that's happened is projection on a massive scale. Because these people always accuse Israel of these same things: colonialism, apartheid, white supremacy, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so on. So I say, maybe for people in America who've been genuinely misled, maybe Grossman's rule still applies, but with a tiny tweak, which is tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you believe you're guilty of.
I've observed, on the left, we've had the 1619 Project, which is to rewrite the American founding to explain sort of America's original sin that it can't be forgiven of. And what I have observed is, you mentioned what's going on now on the right. It's the 1939 Project.
Yes.
It's the.
Don't give them that idea.
Oh, well, I think they already have it. I think
Don't give that title.
Yeah, but if you kind of look, it's the same arguments about the post-World War II order and that Churchill is the villain. And if you sort of accuse the United States and Britain and the Allies of things that would therefore, if you believe them, cause you to now despise the Jewish state. And anyway, you can write a book. If you like that, please write about it. I don't have the same ability that you have to flesh that out. But I've been kind of seeing that. It's the same phenomenon sort of on the right about this self-hatred and then how it manifests itself in your views about.
I think what they're doing, I'd love to know if you agree with this. I think what they're doing is a couple of things. One is they believe that the Jewish state is an ethno-state, and they're jealous because they'd like one. I think that's one of the things that's going on the right in Europe and in America with anti-Israelism. Another thing that I noticed with this revisionism you allude to with the 1939 Project is there is clearly an effort that I've noticed and I've noticed all my life on the European right, which is which now seems to be happening here, which is they believe that the outcome of World War II was the worst possible outcome. As I like to remind them. I can think of at least one other bad outcome. But they've decided it's the worst possible outcome because Stalin remains in power and occupies much of Europe. And why didn't we let the two sides sort of fight it out to the death? And all, these are semi-thoughts, demi-thoughts, sub-thoughts, all of which are sort of what-ifs. I think what they're really doing is, as I say, what a portion of the European right has tried for a long time to do is, we criticize the left, as it were, we on the right, criticize the left for not taking account of the extremities of their actions. And that's an absolutely valid argument. The international left never worked out how you get to the gulag. And so they just sort of forgot about it, or just, how do you get there? Too much collectivism? Probably. What else? We don't know. Where is the point where it goes wrong and you go from collectivism to the gulag? We don't know. Wouldn't it be worth finding out? That project was almost entirely intellectually abandoned. But on the right, we knew where you get from normal conservative thought to Auschwitz. And we knew that it was once you start playing games of racial supremacy and much more. I think what this 939 Project wants to do is to say, look, instead of contending with things that have happened, as it were, where the right could go wrong, instead of contending with that, we're going to go around it. Just going to go around the mountain. Instead of having to go through it, over it, contend with it, go over it, you say, let's just go around. Let's just say it didn't happen, or I don't know, National Socialism was just socialism. And
Hitler was misunderstood.
My favorite ones is there's some sub-historian who now claims that Hitler kept the anti-Semitism down in the 1930s, which hard to read any text of Adolf Hitler's and come to that comparison, that belief. But these are the sort of things they're doing, and they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they think that all mucked up the project they want to do now. Fine. We will take these non-thoughts apart, and I trust we'll win.
Well, Thank you so much. I do want to just, we've got a very patient, wonderful audience here. And so I just want to give, do you have time to take a couple of questions from the audience? Yeah. Kennedy is in charge here. You just tell me, you wave me off when I've talked to you. So Douglas's wonderful assistant was my assistant. And so I've like the biggest, compliment that I could have is that she left me for him. And so I
think that's the first time that's been said to me.
So we're all very grateful for Kennedy. So thank you, Kennedy. So audience, yep, right here. Just state your name. And here, we've got a microphone here for you. So.
I'm Steve Traver. I'm interested in, to what extent do you think that we're working the anti-Semitism problem with organizations who advertise themselves as being philosophical leaders, when in fact they're just criminal organizations. They're just the mafia. And the approach associated with dealing with one or the other is one, you try to convince them through logic and historical precedent and stuff, and the other is you just go after their money. And so how does that influence then what really keeps Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah going? Is the money, or is it we just need to talk them out of the fact that they're wrong in their philosophy?
I think probably both. Yes, there are so few people who are on this hobby horse that I have to reiterate something I said. The vast reservoirs of Qatari money that have flooded through this country, and particularly this city, are astonishing and get almost no media or other attention. The Qataris have been exceptionally clever and generous in the way in which they have taken institutions and others under their sort of protection, in a way, financial protection. It's a kind of racket. Many of the groups, you're absolutely right, there's a sort of intellectual facade to them. But again, we've seen that before. I mean, we just have to not be fooled by it. Remember in the 1980s, there was a thing in the Cold War that any university that set up a peace studies department was never interested in peace studies. It was interested in advancing Soviet communist ideas under the guise of peace studies. It's exactly the same thing that's going on now. And I think we just have to not be fooled by them. I think that turning off the money spigots would be very useful. My own belief is that the washing through this country of Qatari money will be someday seen in the same way that Saudi financing was after 9/11. And I think institutions and others should get out now on that money hose. But yes, I think that it's probably a both approach, that these ideas, the cutting off of the thing that has mainstreamed these ideas so much, but also the persuading people out of the cult, which is what much of this is. I watched to go straight to the ridiculous, I watched those sort of things where young college grads are weeping in their keffiyeh and COVID mask, because as I'm sure you'll all agree, the support for Intifada always goes hand in hand with a fear of the COVID-19 virus. It's a deep problem for them. Weeping that they have to return home to their family for Thanksgiving, and how can they, because their family are not pro-Palestinian. Poor family. They've got this deranged daughter coming back from campus wearing a keffiyeh and a nose ring and believing that unless the family in Arkansas are suitably pro-Hamas, the turkey cannot be eaten.
One here. Sorry, this is the last one.
We could take maybe two at once.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief.
Take two.
Thank you, Rebeccah. John Sidelides with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Mr. Murray, you've written about the decline of Europe, the danger of mob mentalities, and your subtitle here is Israel and the Future of Civilization. Can I ask you to just pull this up to the sort of 30,000-foot level and give us your sense of the danger of what we saw taking place on October 7th, the reaction to that, and what it means for Europe and the United States.
And then we'll take another question
The
and
lady
then
at
let
the
him.
back.
Yeah. Well, there was one more back here.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'm curious, I saw a clip that you did with Chris Williamson talking about the state of Britain and the political situation, also like the cultural spirit. And something that I've been thinking about for a few years is, to what extent is there health in conservative movements across Europe? But also I'm curious about the interaction now between American conservatism and European conservatism. I think I've seen with things like CPAC and others, almost a Europeanization of American conservatism in certain ways, like more respect for monarchies, raising up the model of Hungary. And I don't think all of these things are without merit, but there is a sense in which I feel like some American conservatism is going to this like glory days mentality of it was great when things were just older and more traditional in general, versus traditionally American conservatism codified a certain set of liberties from the British tradition at a fixed point in history that we then try to enact through the Constitution. What do you think about that interaction and then the health of European conservatism?
So the questions are actually related, so we'll kind of let you.
I think there's one thing, I'll try to answer both again. There's one thing that's particularly interesting in the arguments that go on the conservative side, which is that one of the most important things you have to contend with on the conservative side is the disadvantage that conservatives are inevitably at, for one reason in particular. My late friend Roger Scruton pointed this out at something we were both at in Sweden many years ago, which is that the left has one distinct advantage, which is that they call for the same thing everywhere, or the same things. It's always, equality, justice, normally means revenge, and a set of other things, equitable distribution of wealth, The conservatives' side is always at a disadvantage because we're all conserving different things. And one of the very funny things, as well as very interesting things that always happens whenever you try to cohere conservatives, which is always the same thing as trying to herd cats, is that you discover that they're simply all conserving different things. Sweden and Norway seem to an outsider to be very similar countries, but they're wildly different, and they're conserving very different things. The same with Denmark or any country. I mean, we in Britain are conserving something very different from what they're conserving in France, and France is our nearest neighbor. Belgium, but anyway. The Belgians, I don't know what they're conserving anymore. But this is such an interesting problem. So an American conservative meets a British or European conservative, and they're simply conserving something wildly different. I mean, America is conserving the spirit of the revolution. In Britain, we dislike revolution. And so there's always a sort of some things you don't speak about. As I like quoting, rather surprisingly, the late Jessica Mitford, who said that when she was being brought up and educated to the extent she was, the idea was that we knew nothing, and I think it was the same in my education, we knew nothing about American history other than the supposition that at some point in the 18th century, the Americans did something bad and we don't talk about it. But these are very, very different traditions, and so if you try to lump them together, you will always be at a great disadvantage. But I think it's a preposterous dead-end project when I hear certain influential online voices on the right in America playing with ideas like monarchy and so on. It's a sign of sort of ill health because you don't know what you're really doing. On the question of where the sort of 30,000 feet thing, one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I was very despondent about the state that America and the rest of the West has got itself into in recent years. And I explained what the problems were in Europe, in the strange death of Europe, and then America with the war on the West. But I was despondent, among other things, because of the elevation of grievance as the greatest good in the society, which is effectively that that it's like it's part of the oppressor-oppressed narrative, obviously. If you can simply go into any situation to find out who the person is who can claim to have been most wronged, you give that person the microphone and they win. And there are so many things to be said about that, the problem of it. The problem is what we've seen, which is that you create an incentive structure that incentivizes victimhood and grievance. And then, well, we've all got grievances. I mean, part of the issue is trying to absorb them and move on with your life. But if the culture says, no, don't move on, you don't absorb them, you've got to be stuck in them. And what's more, worship it, you end up in a very, very vicious place. That's one of the reasons why I actually finished this book on a pretty optimistic note, because there's a generational issue which we have all thought about since 1945, which is, if that happened again, would we be up to the moment? Would we be up to the moment of our parents and grandparents? Everybody born in the West with any sentience should have spent at least a significant portion of their life wondering about that. Would I be able to do what an 18-year-old American was able to do in the 1940s or in the 19-teens? And that is an appropriate way to weigh yourself up and to judge yourself. And the interesting thing was that the same thought, the same issue existed in Israel, which was the generation who fought in 67 and 73 had the belief that young Israelis were a bit soft, just wanted to party in Tel Aviv, wanted to be on Instagram and TikTok and so on. And I quote in the book something that moved me very deeply when a man who was a driver in Tel Aviv said to me, I fought in 67 and 73, and he said, I owe the younger generation an apology. I thought they weren't up to it, and they've been magnificent. And that's my observation, is that all of these young people who people thought maybe they're not quite up to the moment, okay, have absolutely shown themselves to be up to the moment. And, of all the soldiers I've spent the last 18 months with, young men, young women, some not so young, but serving in uniform in reserves and so on. These are people who literally were judged as maybe not being up to the task, and wow, have they proved their critics wrong. And so for me, there's this big question that I have, which I sort of allude to at the end of the book, which is, if you are a young Westerner, you have a couple of choices offered to you here. One is, do you want to attack your colleagues, your contemporaries, your fellow students and others in Israel as war criminals and rapists and every vicious lie you can throw about them? Do you want to cover yourself in badges and pretend you're some kind of activist, grudge creator? Or would you like to be a real person? A real person, a heroic person? And this is what Israel has shown the way on. They've shown how a country that is Western, but in a worse neighborhood than us, can both assert the rights of in the proper sense, liberal and democratic society, assert the rights of that, and know you have to fight for them. That's what they've shown, and they've shown it magnificently. And I think that instead of being lambasted by their contemporaries in the West, their contemporaries in the West should weigh themselves in the balance against these young Israelis. And if they did, they would find themselves wanting, not the young men and women of the IDF.
Douglas, thank you. Please join me in
Thank you.